Angelica Sperber. All right, well, welcome to Sperb episode 12. Today we have an exciting herb, Melaleuca Cajuputi, a common name often known as paperbark. We're going to see lots of other names for it as well. Paperbark. This is our actual first Aboriginal herb that we are talking about on Sperb Herbs. And if you know anything about me, which most of you probably don't, I spent 4 years in medical school down in Australia, and I spent 6 months in the working with the Aboriginal community. So I have some interesting insights into this, and it should be a lot of fun. So let's get into episode 12, Melaleuca Cajuputi paperbark. It's not easy to say quickly. And for our podcasters, if you are an acupuncturist, this podcast, as well as others, are approved for CAB CEUs and NCCOM PDAs at a reasonable cost. You just need to go to integrativemedicinecouncil.org, and you can find that out as well. I also have a new book coming out called Dragons in the Medicine Cabinet, Chinese Herbal Medicines Everyone Should Have at Home. If you're interested in getting information, please send me an email at drgreg@sperbsherbs.com. All right, let's get into it. So, I always find it fascinating when we talk about herbs. I think it's really important to talk about the culture that the herbs come from, because that spins a lot of what's going on. And today we're going to be talking about the Aboriginal culture, and specifically because there are Aborigines in many parts of the world. We're talking about Australian Aborigines or Aboriginal culture. And I want to say, even though I just said I have been I was down there for 4 years, and I was actually part of a special program that our medical school had. We were only the second cohort. I think there was only 3 in our cohort. There was 1 in the first cohort, and it was called the Out of Alice program. And it put you in Alice Springs for 6 months working with Aborigines in Central Australia. And for that 6 months, it was amazing. I was able to be part of the Royal Flying Doctor Service, and I'd fly in and out of Aboriginal communities. I spent quite a while with the psychology and social work team, so we'd go out to communities for several days at a time and deal with their psychological and social worker needs. So that was fascinating. I was in a community clinic in Alice Springs that was specifically geared towards working with Aboriginals, and so it was a lot of fun. And then I actually spent 6 weeks in living in an Aboriginal community and working out of their community healthcare setup. So it was a lot of fun, and I learned a ton. And while going through all that, I went through something called the Aboriginal Cultural Awareness Program, or ACAP, and so I learned a lot about the culture. But having said all that, I do want to start off by saying this. I am no expert on the Aboriginal people of Australia. I've done a lot of reading and studying and live with them, but not for any length of time that I would consider myself an expert, though I do have some very interesting insights as we get into this. And so, the first thing I want to just say, we often, especially in the United States, we talk about the Aborigines as sort of a monolithic culture. And it's not true. Australia is actually the size of mainland America. If you take out Hawaii and you take out Alaska, which is huge, Australia is the same size as America. It doesn't look like that on a map because it's kind of small down there on a globe or something. But it's a very large country, just like America. And just like America, there's many different climates. There's a ton of different peoples, cultures, traditions, and actually languages. When we talk about the Aborigines, I was told there were somewhere in the neighborhood of like 3,000 languages, and each one of those is cultures. It's very, very tribal and very community oriented. And while there was a lot of trade and a lot of communication between these different communities, they were all very distinct with their own cultures, their own languages. And so to say Aboriginal is a very inaccurate thing to say. In fact, the herb that we're talking about today, the Melaleuca Cajuputi, is actually Northern Territory. So it's up in the north, and actually there's a cousin of Melaleuca Cajuputi, I think, in Central Australia, but probably has nothing to do with Central Australian Aborigines at all. So there's that sort of thing. Found it fascinating with the languages. They are very distinct. I think they're family of languages, so kind of like Latinate languages. So there's some overlap between the languages, but not that much. And my understanding is that within a community, most people will speak 2 or 3 or 4 different languages, different languages than other people in that community. So there's a lot. So they're able to actually communicate with other Aborigine peoples as well. So it's really interesting. But I want to make this important. It's difficult to talk about the Aboriginal people or their traditions because they are so diverse. And if you're up in the north, you're living in a tropical climate. It's equatorial, hot, rainy, wet, very different climate than it is in the rest of Australia, really. There's the coastal Australia, and then there's the interior Australia. And except for the coastal in the north, everything else is pretty much a desert. So very, very different. And different deserts, within that community. So let's get into this a little bit more. So one of the first things I like to do personally when learning about a new culture is to understand their basic philosophy and or religion. To me, that helps me understand their worldview. And it was actually it was difficult because I'd asked these questions and I never got a really great answer to them. It took a lot of time for me to kind of digest what this was for most of the Aboriginal communities. And so really what it comes down to with the Aborigines is something called dream time. They have a lot of differences, they have different origin stories, but they all do seem to have the dream time in common. So dream time is a quote-unquote time before current history where ancestral beings, usually half human, half animal, wandered over the country, creating all the features on the landscape and setting up the law. So, this right there gives us a few things. So, like, we drive through the country, and I was very lucky. We actually had a Nunkery as a guide. A Nunkery is sort of, I'm trying to figure out, is sort of the medicine man of a Central Australian Aboriginal community. So he was very well versed in medicine, and he had been, I believe he was part of the Stolen Generation. If you're not familiar with the Stolen Generation, it's just one of the tragedies that have befallen the Aborigines. But for several decades, the Aboriginal government were stealing the children and putting them with European Australians and having them go to school and separating them from their parents and all that. And their idea was that this is helping them, this will help them integrate and all that. And of course, it was a huge tragedy. So this Nunkery that we were working with had grown up in Western schools and understand our culture very well, but also as a Nunkery, he completely was immersed and understood the culture of the Aborigines, and so it was fascinating. He was touring us, and it would be fascinating. We'd be driving along, and there'd be a mountain range, and he'd sit there and go, "Okay, that's this," and he'd come up with some name, and it's one of these ancestral beings, and he would talk about how they stomped around, and you see all the pools around the base of it. That was their footprints, and then they laid down and died, and that became the mountains. And so that's sort of this dream time. That's the ancestors. And there's stories, there's myths, along the lines of like the Greek gods and some fights and some all that kind of stuff would come in. But that was dream time, and and I do think it kind of lays down how important what is important in this culture is talking about this. So the land and the way the land is shaped and made and the animals are incredibly important, and it comes from this dreamtime thing. The other thing that's really important is the law, and they have some really interesting laws that they follow, and it's fascinating, and they have definite punishments for law. One of the ones that I know, I think if someone is convicted of stealing in their community, the law says that you throw a spear through their calf muscle. That's punishment for doing that. So very, relatively severe, but sort of sacred laws. The other one that was fascinating to me is there's sacred men's business and there's sacred women's business. And a man is not to know anything about sacred women's business. I was working in the community, in the Aboriginal community, in a clinic, and every time a pap smear or anything to do with pregnancy or menses or anything, I had to leave the room. It was against the law for me to be in that room. Same token, if a woman shows up at a men's ceremony, and there are lots of interesting men's ceremony, I have some stories about that, some very weird stories about that. But if a woman were to go to a man's ceremony, the penalty was death. So really strong laws, and they follow them. It's fascinating as you get into all this stuff. So this dream time sets up a lot of what is important. The land, it features the importance of harmony and caring for the land, and the laws to support these. And we're going to have a story in just a second, and just the way they are in harmony with the land and the world and the environment around them is just amazing, and I think it contributes to our understanding of herbs within the Aboriginal community. So it's important for us to kind of get this established a little bit. I mean, that's really brief overview of Dreamtime. And again, I'm still, I've read a lot on this, and I'm still not entirely sure about it, but I think I have a handle on it. So that's Dreamtime. So from this Dreamtime, we have the landscape as it is, and it is a harsh environment. Australia has more desert than any other continent in the world. 90% of Australia's population lives within 10 to 20 miles of the coast. So very few people are living on the inside of Australia. The other one that I love to talk about here is, I think it's 6 of the 10 the world's most deadliest spiders live on Australia, and I think it's 7 of the 10 most deadliest snakes live in Australia, and I swear I saw them all. Most of them outside. I mean, I saw them all definitely in herpetariums and zoos and stuff, but I saw quite a few of them out live. There was a nice little brown snake in our pharmacy one morning, which is I think it's ranked number 2 or 3 in the world as far as deadliest snakes. So, and by the way, as soon as they said brown snake in the pharmacy, I was out of the clinic. I am not into snakes. I was gone. But it is a very harsh environment, and to live there, and remember, there's very little water in Australia. Where I was living in Alice Springs, they didn't really their rule for if you were a native to Alice Springs was if you saw the river flood 3 times. Because it's a completely dry riverbed, and then when there's lots of rains, it will rain and the water will flow for a period of time and then dry up again, and it usually takes years between that will happen. I happened to be there in a very wet time. I saw it flow twice, so it was almost a native in the 6 months that I was there. But so very little water, and it comes and goes. Apparently there's lots of water underground if you know how to get it and how to get it from the plants. There's water out there, and the Aborigines know all this. They're just amazing in that. So the Australian Aborigines have lived on this harsh land and has one of the longest standing cultures on the planet. There are estimates that it's over 40,000 years old, and I should say longest standing continuous cultures on the planet. I don't think there's any other culture on the planet that is been as continuous as these Aboriginal cultures. So very, very old. No written language particularly, though they do draw and stuff like that. And our Nunkri was awesome. He's like, you got to stop, you got to see this, and he'd bring us to a cave, and there'd be drawings in the cave, which were fascinating. He explained to us what it meant and all that. But 40,000 years old, and everything is verbal. It's handed down in songs and wisdom and verbs and verbal communication. Though the one thing that's interesting about the culture is you're not supposed to ask questions. You're supposed to observe, and rarely are you allowed to ask questions. And I ran into that. I'm not going to get into that, but maybe it's some other when I talk about another Australian herb. So the bottom line is they have a deep, deep connection with the land. One of the stories that I was told about this was the Australian government came in and said, "Hey, let's help these people out. Let's build them homes." And so they built a bunch of homes for the Aboriginal people. Didn't talk to the Aborigines, didn't talk to the chiefs, just did it. And then they were really upset. The government officials were really upset when they come back years later, and all the Aborigines are still living out on the land, sleeping out on the land, and the houses were just full of trash. And when they asked, well, why aren't you using the houses? And the Aborigines would just look at them and go, why would we ever live in some place that prevented us from seeing the stars, from being outdoors? It was just beyond them that anyone would think that they would want something like that. So it was just fascinating cultural stuff. And anyways, let's move on. So I promised you a little story that I think kind of summarizes a lot of this going on. There's a wonderful, sobering, harsh, anger-inducing book about the history of the Aborigines in the Northern Territory and their interactions with the Balanda, or Nana-Aboriginals, called "Why Warriors Lie Down and Die." It's a good read. It captures your attention, but it's not a fun read. And there's a passage in there describing the author walking with the Aborigines. So this is him talking. Well, not quite yet. After he arrived in Arnhem Land in 1973, the author was traveling by barge, then 25 miles on land with a tractor pulling a trailer, which broke down. So he was going to a particular Aboriginal community. So the tractor broke down. He was interested. He was saying, everyone was like, okay, we walk from here on. It was like no big deal. The tractor broke down. Let's just walk. So they began walking. And this is his story. As we filed out across the tidal plain, heading for the woodland ahead, I joined the leader up front like a good Balanda. We were following the two tracks in the grass made by the vehicles in their journey out. The people were on one track behind the leader, and I was on the other beside the leader. We walked for a while when my companion said, "Brother, walk behind me here." Not knowing what he had in mind, I did as I was told for a while. But then I rejoined him, walking on the parallel track. Again, he beckoned me to walk behind. This made me very uncomfortable. I could hear him say in Yolnu Matha, which is their language, "Walk behind me," but I could not understand the other things he said, which presumably explained the reason for this instruction. Maybe it's because he's the boss and doesn't want anyone else up front with him, I thought. After a kilometer or so, my cultural instincts overtook me and I moved up beside him again. This time he stopped. The whole line of people came to a standstill as he motioned me back behind him. I was starting to feel a bit stupid. What is going on in this guy's head? I asked myself. Just then, I found out. We had only gone another 30 meters or so that would be about 90 feet, when a large snake came out of the middle of the track and headed for cover, traveling right across the path I had just been walking on. After the group calmed down and they were sure the Bapi had gone for cover, we continued on. I was a bit stunned. So that was what he was trying to tell me, I thought soberly. If I had still been on that track, the snake would have wrapped around my legs. He was not only concerned for me, he was just as concerned for himself because I could have disturbed the snake and frightened it into his legs. Remember, we're talking about a place where almost all the snakes are deadly. I learned 3 things that day. That the Yolnu Matha word for snake was Bapi, that I should always trust the people while in their environment, and that Yolnu as a group of people have knowledge Balanda don't have. And I think that kind of sums up a lot of the culture. I have a lot of respect for the culture. 40,000 years of their knowledge base is just massive. So that is a little overview of the Aboriginal people of Australia. If anyone has any questions or anything, I'm happy to work with you. Okay, so let's get into Melaleuca Cajuputi. So it's from the family Myrtaceae, which is myrtles. Myrtles are myrtle trees. That's the family. So as we talked about in earlier Sperb herbs, Myrtaceae, or myrtles is the family. Melaleuca would be the genus, and Cajuputi would be the species. The medicinal part of the Melaleuca Cajuputi is the leaves. Other names for this, as we already talked about, is paperbark. And then there's a bunch of Aboriginal names: Rongan, Mamara, Jakara, Badar, Nambara, Thail. By the way, I have no idea how to pronounce these from an Aboriginal point of view, so please forgive my pronunciations. Cajuput is spelled with a U in the middle, an E in the middle, an A in the middle. So there's lots of different spellings of that. White Samet, Delic Air, Gellum or Gellum, Nippus Kalit, Pocock, Cajuputbom, and Swamp Tea Tree. Now this last one's an interesting Swamp Tea Tree. So I think tea tree oil has become really popular in the last few years, and is a really useful medicinal substance for a lot of things. And this is related to that. Now, technically, tea tree is a different species of Melaleuca than Cajuputi, though I did find one article that said that different species of Melaleuca actually are used as tea tree oil in different parts of the world where they're grown and where they're processed. And Melaleuca Cajuputi is actually one of those that can be considered tea tree oil in certain parts of the world. But technically, it's a different species than Cajuputi. It was first described in the West in 1809 by Thomas Powell in the Pharmacopoeia of the Royal College of Physicians of London. So that is the first description in the West. Melaleuca Cajuputi is a tree found in the Northern Territories, Queensland, and Western Australia. And those are all in Australia, so Northern Territories and Queensland. Queensland is just east and south of the Northern Territories. And Western Australia, of course, is on the west. And then Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, Malaysia are all north. We have Thailand, Singapore, and Vietnam will actually have this Melaleuca Cajuputi. And generally in coastal plains or seasonal swamps, so it actually needs lots of water. Several of these locations have been planted, actually, so that it is actually grown and cultivated, especially in Java and Malaysia. There's some interesting uses of some of this that we're going to get into. There are many species of Melaleuca found throughout Australia, and generally they have similar uses. So even if it's not Melaleuca Cajuputi, there's a lot of other species, and they're very similar. So as we go through this, my book had 4 or 5 different species. They all had pretty much the same uses. So what we talk about here is probably applicable to many other species of Melaleuca. Lassica McCarthy wrote a book in 1990, state that there are many synonymous species to Cajuputi, including Saligna minor, Chinervis, lancifolia, leucodendron, and others. Another source says Melaleuca quinquenervia is also a synonym. So I want to take a little exception to this, and this is Lassica McCarthy wrote this in 1990. Their book actually was a little bit more emphasis on the herbal uses of these things, and didn't appear to me to be quite as scientific as some of my other sources. The reason why I say this is they say these are synonymous species. Other sources say they are not. This leucodendron, one source said, is actually sort of the community of Melaleuca in this realm of things, and includes a lot of other species rather than a specific species of itself. I guess my point is the source texts kind of say these. One says these are synonymous species, others don't. I think that it kind of goes back to my first bullet point here is, even if they're slightly different species, they generally have similar uses and therefore can be considered synonymous, at least for herbal usage and all that, even if they are completely different species. So the indications for when we would use this in Aboriginal medicine, it's used to treat congestion and pain associated with respiratory infections. So that's really what it is. It's also used to treat pain, burns, and dyspepsia, upset stomachs, in addition to colds and influenza, and other parts of the world, and other Aboriginal cultures, other than the Northern Territory. So has lots of wide thing. Now, I should, just a brief mention here. One of my side projects I always wanted to do while going through medical school was to learn about Aboriginal herbology. I had studied Chinese herbs and was very interested in herbology, and I'm going over there for 4 years. Why not learn about Aboriginal herbology. And I ran into several barriers. Some of them I think were just, mistrust of a Belanda. And there was some cultural stuff there. Again, I told you, culturally, you don't ask questions. We were trained in medicine, like in the emergency room, we were told not to ask the question of why are you here. We were told what we were supposed to do was kind of shuffle around, eyes down. You don't look them in the eyes down on the floor, and talk about the weather or something else benign, and then they will tell you why they're actually in the emergency room. You're not supposed to go up and ask them why they're in the emergency room. Now, in actual workings, most of us did ask them why they were in the emergency room, but traditionally, culturally, you're not supposed to. So when I'd ask about Aboriginal herbology, I didn't get much in the way of information from a lot of sources. But there was one day, it was interesting, and it was a few of us medical students that were there, and we went out scavenging for what's known as bush tucker or bush food, with a couple of and this is sort of the translation of what they say, old women or old grandmothers. And so we were out and we were digging around roots. We found a root grub. One of my fellow students found a root grub, and he ate it, which is supposed to be great food, and it's also medicine. And that was sort of what I got from this sort of expedition out with these grandmas, is there wasn't a lot of distinction between food and medicine. It was like for example, the root grub, if you ate it raw, it was food, and if you cooked it, it was medicine. Well, what would you use that for? It was like, well, you use it when you need to use it, is sort of the answer I got. So it wasn't like there was distinct and quantifiable and qualifiable, herbs that I could see. It was just like, okay, this food can also be used as an herb if it's prepared that way, or this herb is a food in these circumstances, and you eat more of this when you're this way, or you eat more of that when you're that way. So it was difficult, as far as I could tell, to actually kind of get a really clear definition of what herbs were doing for what. And I ended up buying a lot of books on this topic, and the books tend to be all written by Belanda, and so I don't think they really get at why the Aborigines use a particular herbal medicine or not. There's a lot of superficiality to it, I feel like, but still fascinating, and I'm still trying to learn. So in preparing Melaleuca Cajuputi, the Aborigines have three major preparations. The first is inhalation, and I love this one. It's achieved by crushing a few young leaves by hand, and the vapor is inhaled to help nasal and bronchial congestion. So just to kind of give an idea, if you've ever smelled tea tree oil, it kind of has that eucalypty sort of smell to it. And this is, I think in the myrtle family are the eucalyptus trees. And so it has that sort of really kind of powerful aromatic smell to it. So you can see just, crushing this and then sniffing it and inhaling the vapors could actually help open up the nasal cavities and bronchial congestion. So that's the first preparation, is inhalation. The second is a wash, and it's created by crushing a large handful of leaves and boiling them in water. The liquid and leaves are rubbed into the chest or aching joint. So if it's into the chest, of course, if it's a chest cold, aching joints if it's more for pain. A small amount of the liquid can be sipped, and I actually saw this and getting into the toxicity of stuff is it's actually low toxicity. We'll talk about that in just a few, but you don't want to drink a lot of it, basically. The steam produced during boiling can be inhaled, and that makes a lot of sense. That would be almost like doing an essential oil in a vapor machine. These method in a steaming machine. Sorry. These methods are used as a rubefacient. If you're not, I wasn't familiar with this word. I had to look it up. And what a rubefacient is something that reduces redness topically. So you put it on, and it would actually distribute. It would actually change the redness and help it to go away. So it's a topical use of this. It's used as a decongestant to help breathing, and an expectorant, so it actually brings up phlegm and helps you to cough that out, to treat bronchitis, sinusitis, and colds. We see that a lot in when we're talking about this is flus, colds, bronchitis, sinusitis, all that stuff. And the third preparation is after you do this wash, you can also apply it as eardrops to treat an earache. So you take the liquid and you apply them directly to the ear, and that can help an earache as well. So you can see from all of these sort of things, at least from a scientific point of view, there's got to be some antibacterial and probably some antiviral properties to this as well. And when we look at the science, we'll see that that's the case. So in other parts of the world, it's used internally for stomach cramps, colic, and asthma. That makes sense. As an ointment or liniment externally for neuralgia or nerve pain, and rheumatism, so that's the stiff joints and low back pain. Also for toothaches and earaches, and potentially for treating tumors. It's considered to be anti-tumor medication as well. The oil can be used as an insect repellent for treating worms, especially they said roundworms are really good for that. And even infections of the genitourinary system. I would imagine, I don't know a ton about all this stuff, but I would just imagine you want to make sure that you got the dilution just right before applying it anywhere near the genitals or anything along those lines. I would think it could be a little bit harsh in some of those areas. It's also used as a flavoring in cooking and a fragrance in soaps, cosmetics, detergents, and perfumes. We're not getting into it too much, but there's actually a lot of economic uses for this plant. And since this is herbs, it's not about the economics of it. We don't get too much into it. But it is cultivated in certain parts of the world. It is used here, as you can see, in a lot of stuff other than herbally. Though you can make a point that in all of these, the soaps, cosmetics, detergents, and perfumes, there might be an herbal application to it, like an insect repellent or helping redness or anything along those lines, so that you can see some of the herbal aspects of this. It is used, the wood and some of the other parts are used for buildings, but that's relatively, it doesn't seem to be really strongly used for anything in that sort of circumstances. So it isn't generally used for its wood. And my understanding is it grows in like poles, so it's not like something you would make into planks or anything like that. It's just briefly looking at it, it's used as poles to hold up corners and things along those lines. So it's not huge in that aspect of things. What was surprising me is I just check on Amazon and see if I can get anything with Melaleuca Cajuputi. And I can. There are actually many sources that had it as an essential oil. And when you look at those, it says it's used to treat cuts, scrapes, bug bites, and as an antiseptic. It also was found in various lotions, detergents, and other products, including toothpaste. So what I just said about preparation in certain parts of the world, we can certainly get those things here in the U.S. I looked at the U.S. Amazon. So, you can find Melaleuca Cajuputi or Cajuput toothpaste if you want to give this a go for that. So I thought that was kind of fascinating. What I didn't find was like being able to find the leaves. Because my guess is because the aromatic oils, and as we know, aromatics don't tend to dry well necessarily, the aromatic oils, and so it's usually processed as an essential oil. And I did not see any dried leaves. I didn't see any way to actually get a raw herb out of this. I only saw really the essential oils and these various products easily available. So that was interesting to me, because most herbs we can just buy some form of it and use it how we wish, but not in this case. I didn't see anything like tablets or capsules or anything to take this internally either. So let's talk about its Chinese medical actions. There does not appear to be any direct translation of Cajuput to Chinese medicine. I couldn't find anything in any of the Materia Medica, nor could I find anything in several different authors' attempts to translate herbs into Chinese medical actions. The only thing I did see, the closest was translating the essential oil into Chinese medicine. And there was one company, Snow Lotus, that describes it as having the function of tonifying qi, raising yang qi, and warming the interior and strengthening the spirit. So that was one attempt, but it was just the essential oil. That was just the essential oil. So we're kind of left to our own devices as to what this does, and I've given my best guess as to what this is from a Chinese medical point of view. From its traditional uses, we get some idea of how it works in Chinese medicine. Since it works on colds and respiratory infections, it probably releases the exterior and is acrid and definitely aromatic. Every description talks about it being aromatic. So acrid and aromatic. Since it is a rubefacient, reducing skin redness, we can assume it is cooling in nature from a Chinese point of view, so it's cooling. Since it relieves pain and congestion, it's probably damp draining and qi and possibly blood moving. I'm going to probably go a little bit more on the qi moving here. So that leaves a few questions for us to ask about it. Since it treats respiratory conditions, does it tonify lung qi, or is it just exterior relieving? My answer to that is it probably doesn't, because it's only used, as far as I can tell, when someone's in the throes of congestion and flu. So I would think it tends towards just exterior relieving. Since it is a decongestant and expectorant, does it transform phlegm? And given its aromatic nature, this is probably likely. Since it appears to be antibacterial, antiviral, does it clear toxic heat? And that is a good question, which I don't really have a great answer for. So the probable summary, this is what I'm putting forward as its Chinese medical properties are: it's acrid or spicy acrid, aromatic, cool, enters the lung, and I put question mark the liver due to its qi moving aspects. It's a question mark. It drains and transforms damp phlegm heat, regulates qi, and releases the exterior. So that's my summary of the Chinese medical actions of Melaleuca Cajuputi. Definitely open for discussion, argument, disagreement, all that sort of stuff. I would love to have someone else's opinion on where all this comes from and what it can do according to Chinese medicine. So some comparisons. The real comparison here is the tea tree oil that we talked about earlier. Similar to tea tree oil, which is probably stronger in its antimicrobial properties. I know I have, my mom loved tea tree oil on her joints. It was one of the few things that could actually help her joints. So she always got creams and liniments. She wouldn't take my Chinese stuff. She loved the tea tree oil. My stuff, I think, smelled too much for her. The Chinese stuff, I think, was just too strong for her. So that's probably the closest. And as we said, it's another species of Melaleuca, so it's pretty similar to it. I think it's more popular and more easily attainable. Though tea tree products aren't that cheap, especially if they have a decent amount of tea tree oil in them. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the synonymous Melaleucas that we talked about earlier are actually used in the production of tea tree oil. So it's possible that depending on where it's grown and processed, some tea tree oils are actually Cajuput. So very similar, though the real tea tree oil is probably a little stronger in its antimicrobial properties. And I don't think it's used that much for the respiratory issues that we have necessarily. So that's a big comparison for Melaleuca. So the science. So one of the issues that I had with the science is there wasn't a lot of research that I found on it. I found a lot of Indian research, which was interesting, and some research in those countries that we talked about, like Indonesia, Malaysia. Malaysia seemed to have quite a bit of research on it, but it was more about its constituents and things along those lines. Not a lot about how effective it is or what it actually is used for. There just wasn't a ton of science around that. It did appear that this plant had strong antioxidant and antibacterial activity. That seems to be pretty consistent with the science that I actually saw. None of that is particularly in vivo in human beings. It was more like the chemicals that we extract from this are showing to have these strong activities, not that they were tested in humans. So it was in vitro rather than in vivo, but I still think that's consistent with the Aboriginal usage of this herb. So I feel pretty confident that we can say that Melaleuca Cajuputi is a strong antioxidant and a strong antibiotic. It has been tested for anti-acne. I thought was interesting, and anti-tumor activity. The studies that I showed that I saw that did that. It says though the results were not substantial. I don't mean that they weren't positive. I just mean that they were small studies, and so it's hard to conclude. There was only one study that I saw in each of these, and there were small studies, so it's hard to say that it actually does have anti-acne or anti-tumor activity, but it's certainly there are pointers to that, so it's not something necessarily to dismiss, but definitely to take with a grain of salt. It's probably the anti-acne is probably one of the reasons why it's in cream, one of the uses of the creams as well as anti-acne. As I mentioned, a lot more research needs to be done. One of the things that was also interesting about the science was there was quite a bit of science around the essential oils, and that definitely seems to be where we're at with a lot of the herbal activities of Melaleuca outside of the Aboriginal culture, is in the essential oils. I think it's easy to make and easy to distribute, and therefore it's easy to use in other sources, other places rather than its source. So there was a lot of research on the essential oils, but it all kind of came down to antioxidant and antibacterial for the most part. There needs to be a lot more research done, not just on the essential oils, but also on the leaves and its herbal activities, its beneficial activities as well. What I did like, there was one team led by Noor that said there were some compounds in essential oil that may help depression and anxiety, which I thought was interesting. I'm a little concerned about this information, and the reason why is it wasn't clear if they needed to be taken internally. And just because there are compounds that are recognized as antidepressives and anti-anxiety does not mean that when ingested, those compounds will be absorbed and have those actual activities. It's an interesting pointer, but I don't think it's substantial in any way, shape, or form. I wouldn't start going to my patients who have depression and anxiety and say, okay, let's use this essential oil. Now, what I might do is say, hey, to use essential oils, why don't you try some Melaleuca Cajuputi essential oil and see if that helps anything. I mean, I wouldn't be opposed to that, but I certainly wouldn't be adding it into an herbal prescription or anything along those lines at this point. And I wouldn't go far in doing this. So, but I still think it's fascinating that it has some of that. And it actually goes to what Snow Lotus said about their essential oil, that it actually helps the spirit, benefits the spirit. So that would certainly be in Chinese medicine in this realm of help depression and anxiety. So the contents are interesting. One of the things, I say right off the bat, the dominant component in the essential oil is 1,8 cineole or cineole. Right away, one of the big books that I've used in working on this, they had 3 different samples, and in 2 samples, this was by far the biggest component of the leaves, not just the essential oil, but the leaves. And then the 3rd sample, it was relatively minor. So the reason why I'm saying this is, even though this appears to be in a lot of the literature that I looked at, the dominant component, 1,8 cineole, and again, this is an essential oil. It's in the it's concentrated in essential oils. There's a lot of essential oils in Melaleuca Cajuputi, and we can point at them and say, this is an essential oil, this is an essential oil. what we can't do is say what is the benefit of this specifically. This hasn't been studied as far as I can tell as to what its actions are. So this is dominant, but we don't know exactly why it is or isn't. But it's also, what I'm trying to get at, and I've kind of broken up as we're going along, is just because it is the dominant overall, there are samples that have very small amounts of this. And that was one of the sort of bottom line of, I saw a lot of studies that talked about the contents of this herb, Melaleuca Cajuputi, both the essential oils, the leaves, as well as various other parts of the tree. There was not, it was consistent that this was the dominant component almost all the time, but not every time. There was a lot of inconsistency between samples and a lot of variance depending on the growing conditions and all that. So that's one of the issues. If I'm looking at this as an herbalist, I'm like, I know there's a lot of variability in components of herbs depending on when they're grown, how they're grown, where they're grown, all that sort of stuff, the environment. It seemed to me, and it may just be because I saw a lot more of these studies, because there weren't a lot of other studies to look at, that it seemed to be a little bit more with the Melaleuca Cajuputi than in other herbs that I may or may not be as familiar with, that I'm more familiar with. So there are a lot of other components in the essential oil, both minor and trace, but the 1,8-cineol was the major one. So, and like I said, relatively consistently, but not always. There appears to be a good amount of saponins. Saponins are, in general, a component of plant substances, and they can have various properties to them. The problem is, I didn't see a list of specific saponins that were in Melaleuca Cajuputi, and I tried looking for them. All I saw was some lab results that said there were quite a few saponins. It was a triple plus of saponins on this lab test, but it didn't get into anything. It was sort of a broad test to see if they were present, but it didn't actually get into specifics about which ones were present or what they were actually doing, and I couldn't find that. That was of the leaves, and as I went into the essential oils, there weren't saponins. I don't think saponins are oil are oily. I'm not sure about that, but I don't think they are. So I didn't see anything that I could recognize as a saponin in the essential oil. So I want to know more about these saponins, but I just couldn't find a lot of information about them. And the other thing that was interesting, large amounts of calcium are in the leaves. Quite a bit of calcium is in the leaves. So that probably has no bearing whatsoever on any of the herbal properties, but I found it fascinating. There was very little iron in them, and there was a little bit of a couple other trace elements, but calcium was by far the largest amount that was there. So that's the contents of Melaleuca Cajuputi. As listeners know, I always look at drug-herb interactions. That's my book was a lot of drug-herb interactions, and I gotta say this is one of the few times I have not seen anything on drug-herb interactions. There's no obvious research looking at potential drug-herb interactions in a Google Scholar search. That's sort of my go-to, is to go to Google Scholar and look at least 50 results of the search, and in this case it was Melaleuca Cajuputi drug-herb interactions. Actually, I think I just did interactions, not drug-herb interactions. I did both. I did drug-herb interactions and interactions, and didn't get anything on any potential drug-herb interactions. So there's nothing there, and that doesn't, in my mind, that doesn't speak to the safety of Melaleuca Cajuputi in regards to drug-herb interactions. It speaks to the lack of investigation on this. So I don't want this to be interpreted to say there are no drug-herb interactions with Melaleuca Cajuputi. I think the takeaway is that there's been very little research in this regard, and there needs to be more research to determine if there's any drug-herb interactions with Melaleuca Cajuputi. So what are some concerns? Well, unfortunately, we're still in the same bag. There's not a ton of research on this, nor in 2020. So this is, I'm recording this in 2020, so this is brand new. Showed low toxicity of the essential oil, though it again, we hear again and again, you can, maybe have a little bit of it, but don't take too much of this internally. But they were saying, and I gotta say, it was a relatively positive paper. It was in the scientific literature, not super well established, but a relatively positive paper on Melaleuca Cajuputi. So I take this with a bit of a grain of salt, but they showed low toxicity of the essential oil. I think the fact that it is used in many, many parts of the world, and including the United States, I think there have not been there wasn't in the literature any reports of negative reactions or any toxic reactions. So at least from the literature, NOR says there's low toxicity of the essential oil. I think that's probably substantiated by the dearth, the lack of any scientific information regarding the toxicity of it. Usually if something's toxic, you'll see a case report of someone having a problem. There's nothing like that in Melaleuca Cajuputi that I can see. And as I've said, there was little other research into the safety and toxicity of Cajuput. I think there's a lot that needs to happen on this. I did see other papers that did look a little bit at this when they were looking at antimicrobial and antibacterial properties, and they kind of came to similar conclusions that it's fairly low toxicity, but none of those papers, in my opinion, were super strong, were published in good journals, and weren't anything but sort of like a local interest scientific paper sort of thing. So I'm just going to leave it at there needs to be a lot more research into the safety and toxicity of Cajuput, though at this point it appears to be relatively low toxicity and relatively safe. So that is Melaleuca Cajuputi in a nutshell. It's there's a lot going on with this herb, and it's my as I mentioned at the beginning, it's the first Aboriginal herb that we looked at through Sperb's herbs, and it's interesting. I think it sums up its traditional use by the Aborigines is very Aboriginal. In other words, it's something I think that you use when you pick it. You pick it and it's small leaves, you crush them and inhale them. Big leaves, you're going to boil them up, smell the steam, clear the sinuses, and then maybe drink a little bit of it or rub it on parts that are painful. But it's all used in the moment rather than carried with them and used and stored in some fashion. That's something with the Aboriginal culture that, living there, you really realize is that there is no refrigeration traditionally. Now there is, but there wasn't traditionally, and their customs and their culture is about taking in the abundance that's around you while you have it, because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day. So they don't waste anything, just like Native Americans wouldn't waste things, or any hunters really. They don't waste any of the substances that they get or any of the gifts they get from the land. They really use everything to the nth degree, but they use it in the moment. They don't use it they don't store things in general, and it's sort of a negative thing. But this is again sort of the Belanda coming in and trying to help the Aborigines. One of the things that I think explains this a lot and was an issue living in Aboriginal communities is they were on the dole. That's the Aboriginal. That's the Australian term for like welfare. So they're on the dole, and so they would get checks every 2 weeks. And what many of them would do I don't want to paint too fine of a big of a brush, and of course we have to be careful of cultural biases and all this when we're talking about this stuff. But they would take the check and just gorge them. So they use all the money and they gorge themselves over the next few days. Alcoholism was a big issue, and they would often be big benders after they got the check, and then they wouldn't have any check, and then they would have to figure out how to eat for the next 10 days until the next check came in. And that was just, I think that's cultural, and again I think it's sort of the West trying to put their values on them and not understanding where their values are and meeting them. And of course, in modern day, there's a lot more discussion happening between the Aboriginal leaders and the white people, and hopefully some of this stuff is getting worked on. But I will say, having lived there, I probably saw more racism targeted at Aborigines than I've ever seen in my life before. There's definitely a lot of work that needs to be happening, and I, like I said, I have a lot of respect, and just the knowledge base and what they can do and what they know is just amazing to me. So I'm really fascinated with the Aboriginal people. So that was all to kind of explain that they tend to live now rather than worrying about the future too much. If you kill an animal, you got to eat it right away. There's no refrigeration. I guess there was I think some preparations that could extend that out a bit, but there wasn't a ton of that in the Aboriginal desert. So it was very much we need it now, and the use of this herb follows that. It's like when we need this herb, it'll be there for us, and we'll use this herb. Rather than put it in, I guess, in a Western sense, kind of in a medicine pouch or something, I guess. So, anyways, so that's Melaleuca Cajuputi, also known as Paperbark, and commonly known as Paperbark. I think it is a really interesting herb, and it allowed us to get into a little bit of the Aboriginal culture, just a touch. Our next episode that we're going to be talking about on Sperb Herbs is actually going to be looking at the Nourish the Yin category of herbs, the entire category of Nourish the Yin. So a very important category of herbs, especially for women's issues. The Nourish the Yin herbs are used extensively in Chinese formulas. Please join us as we explore these useful herbs and compare them to each other. So it should be another fascinating episode of Sperb Herbs. Thank you very much. For those listening to the podcast, if you want to help us out, when you buy from Amazon, please use the banner ad on our homepage at spurbsherbs.com. We get a few pennies. You can always get in touch with me, Dr. Greg Sperber, at drgreg@spurbsherbs.com. That's SPERBSHERBS.com, or at our website, www.spurbsherbs.com. Thank you very much. We have our bibliography as usual. I try to have a lot of different sources of our bibliography. This was actually, I got to be honest with you, just as a little aside, this was a little bit smaller bibliography than I'm used to, just because there wasn't a ton of research on this. So usually there's a much larger bibliography because I find more research papers to include in this. But having said all of that, I think we are done.
Sperber. The proceeding was presented by Dr. Greg Sperber. We would like to thank Janelle for all her support and everybody else who contributed to this program.
Janelle.
Timothy Dobbins,
Rogers,
Campbell.